Hi, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from Children's.
And we're coming to you from our Studio Road recording studio here at the library today. Here to continue our conversation about Celtic myths and legends and things like that.
Ooh, interesting.
Yes. Now, last time I told the story of Cuchulainn, if you remember.
I do.
Yes. That was very exciting. One thing about it, first of all, I'm going to talk today mostly about Irish mythology rather than Celtic mythology. I've always used the two terms kind of interchangeably, which is very bad of me as a librarian.
I would have thought they were the same.
Yes, well, the Celtic people, as I said previously, were a tribe that stretched all across northern Europe and spread out into England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland. But each of those countries is very unique, and they all have their own separate mythology.
Okay.
So they may have started from the same root, but they're all very different countries. So Irish mythology is specifically what happened and from the stories of the Irish people.
So the Celtic, would that be specific to Scotland?
No, Celtic includes Irish and Scottish and Welsh and things like that. Those are all part of Celtic mythology. Irish mythology is only a small part of Celtic mythology. So all Irish mythology is Celtic, but not all Celtic mythology is Irish.
Where's the ibuprofen?
Sorry.
It's okay.
I don't mean to make it complicated. Now, I told you the Cuchulainn story last time.
Yes.
What did you think of that now that you've thought about it some more?
Yeah, I mean, I love that you took different elements and just made it your own. And she, is just this amazing female heroine character. That's phenomenal.
Yeah, you kind of have to piece together things in Celtic and Irish mythology. One interesting thing is that, first of all, I'm a storyteller. And what we're talking about here is mythology, and all mythology was once a religion. These are all people that were worshipped at one time by various groups of people. And as I go on and continue talking about other topics, I'm going to be talking about things that are actively worshipped.
I did not realize that either.
Well, it's true. All mythology was religion at one point.
There are no exceptions.
None. Although how seriously the people took their religion, we really don't know.
Wow.
Ancient Greece had that whole pantheon of gods that we'll get to. But the ancient Greek writings that we have from the period of Plato and Socrates and so forth, none of them take the Greek gods seriously at all.
Okay.
Whether that was indicative of the entire society or not, we don't know.
Right.
We'll get to Greek gods later, though. And when it comes to the Irish mythology, we know even less about that. They left behind very little. They wrote stuff down in a runic writing, which they wrote on tree bark, which, guess what, doesn't last very long.
However, last week you mentioned something about a highway and elves and the highway construction being shut down.
Yes, people still believe in these things, like I said.
That's a current story.
In modern times that happened. They changed the highway because they thought the place was sacred to the elves. And there's a big lobbying group that demanded they change the highway, and it was in fact changed.
Okay, so that's definitely an indication of how seriously they take it.
Yes, and I don't want to step on anyone's toes or insult anyone.
Okay.
So I want to state right up front, I'm approaching everything as a storyteller.
Okay.
To me, these are all stories, and I'm trying to give all stories equal weight. And if I accidentally insult anyone worships these gods and these forces and so forth, I want to apologize in advance because that's not my intent. Again, this is all about stories.
Okay.
Which is how I see things. So Ireland. The oldest thing we have written word from Ireland is something called the Book of Invasions. And it's part of Irish mythology. It tells about a wave of people who came to Ireland, conquered it, and then died, or were themselves conquered by the next wave of invaders. There's altogether 7 different ways of people who arise. I didn't bother to memorize all of them. Most of them aren't very important. They came to Ireland, they lived there for a while, they died from a plague, and then the survivor turned into a fish and swam away. It actually happened twice.
Say that last part one more
Changed
time.
into a fish and swam away.
Well, I suppose that explains mermaids.
Exactly. Well, one thing about Irish mythology you'll run into immediately is that stuff just happens for no apparent reason. Mythology is always based on magic, but in Irish mythology in particular, stuff just happens sometimes. And they have no real explanation for why it happens. You just have to sort of roll with it.
I could certainly roll with some good stuff just happening to me right about now.
Well, most of what happened in Irish mythology wasn't that good, unfortunately. The Book of Invasions is probably based on fact.
Okay.
in the sense that Ireland probably was conquered by one group after another.
Right.
And each of them left behind various things. In fact, what we know of as Irish mythology is a combination of a lot of different things. It's the mythology of the Celtic people who settled there, the mythology of the people who were already living there when the Celtic people arrived, and then none of this was written down until after the Christians arrived. There's even a possibility they rewrote some of the stories to make the ancient Irish gods less cool. So right away we're seeing it through a filter. We're not seeing the real pure stuff. Some of these myths weren't even written down until the 1800s, and we're gathering them all together as part of the Irish nationalism movement. So everything we get is filtered.
Yeah.
And we'll probably never really know what the ancient Irish people actually thought or how they worshipped. It's all just a mystery. It's probably always going to remain a mystery. And most of what we've got is fragmented. Some of the stories end like right in the middle, and some of them begin in the middle without telling you who the characters are or what they're doing there.
Well, maybe that's the legacy, is mystery.
Yeah. Well, I said before the fairies were hard to pin down because they're ethereal and mercurial, and the Tuatha De Danann are the gods who were the first generations of what became the fairies. So in a sense, it's fair that we know very little about them, and their own gods are themselves somewhat ethereal and shifting all the time. So you had wave after wave of conquest taking over Ireland. And you had a race of people known as the Firbolg, who ruled Ireland for a while. And Firbolg translates as men of bags, or bagmen. Yeah, no one knows what that means either. That probably was a cool name, or a name that had some significance at some point in human history. But right now, no one knows who the Firbolg really were.
Could that be a correlation to bagpipes?
Probably not. I know there's a tradition of keeping like magical items in a pouch that you carry with you and things like that, charms and so forth. We know about them for sure is that when the Tuatha De Danann arrived, they defeated them. Now you may ask yourself, where did the Tuatha De Danann come from? And the answer is, nobody really knows. They had supposedly studied the arts of magic in all these different countries. And the names of the countries in the written version of the myth are all places that no one has any idea what they're referring to. And they came to Ireland and took over. They defeat the Firbolgs in a series of vicious, brutal battles. They had 4 big advantages, 4 things they carried with them that they brought from the 4 corners of the earth.
Before we get to the 4.
Yes.
So could that insinuate another dimension is where they came from?
Yes, quite possibly.
Okay.
People who are into magic will often think that.
So
well, because we know after they were defeated, they retreated into another dimension. So saying they arrived from somewhere else, it wouldn't be a stretch of the imagination.
Oh.
So
okay.
yeah, the 4 things that they had.
Wait.
Yeah, no, please go ahead.
So when they left to go to the other dimension, what was their mode of how did they do that?
Well, as I mentioned before, the Tuatha De Danann are the progenitors of what we call the Sidhe, S-I-D-H-E,
Yep.
and Sidhe means mound.
Yep.
Now, we know from history that people were buried inside of burial mounds. And so farmers who were digging them up sometimes found like weapons and armor and things like that inside the mounds. So the theory was that the ancient people of Ireland had descended into the earth and gone into these mounds, so why they referred to as the Sidhe.
Okay.
Now, actually, of course, they weren't really living underground. They were living in their own place, but the caves became a portal to wherever they went to.
Right.
It's referred to as the otherworld in some myths, the Celtic otherworld, which is also more or less the same place other characters go to in different parts of Celtic mythology.
Is that literally the word that's used, other world?
It's often translated that way. I'm not sure what the original word is.
Okay.
You see that in almost all the books that mention it.
Cool. Okay, so
Right.
moving on to the 4.
Right, the 4 things. And weirdly, all of them don't become important. If this were another kind of myth where the storytelling was better set up, each of these would play an important role in the coming story, but for the most part, they don't. You have the Stone of Fowl. And the Stone of Fowl will cry out when the true king touches it. So that way they can test kingship to see who should really be king. It never gets used in any story. It just sits there. Although there's a rock today that's referred to as the Stone of Fowl in Ireland. Ireland hasn't had a king in a long time, so it
wait,
never gets used.
is this the backdrop to King Arthur?
It
this
way
preceded it,
predates
right?
him. Yeah, it predates him by quite a distance.
Right.
Yeah.
So like, is that where that story originated?
Probably. There's a lot of early like seeds of things. Arthur is in a lot of ways a Welsh story.
Oh.
This book, Heroes of the Dawn, Celtic myth, includes Arthur as one of the Celtic characters from Celtic mythology.
Okay.
They consider him to be a purely mythical character, and he's included with Welsh mythology in the chapter of that book.
Is that disputed at all?
Yes.
By whom?
Archaeologists believe there may have been a real warlord who actually gathered people together into a cohesive unit. And his name may have been Arthur, is remembered as being Arthur. There's also the idea of folk tales, that King Arthur was like a Paul Bunyan kind of character, whose stories gathered together and were attached to Arthur's name over the years.
Like Robin Hood.
Yeah, like Robin Hood and that kind of thing.
But you said that there's reason for them, so what evidence suggests that he was an actual person?
They found archaeological evidence. After the Romans left England, they brought with them the entire class of educated people who came with them. They all abandoned England when Rome gave up on its colonies. And that destroyed the entire infrastructure of England.
Wow.
Anybody who knew how to build a bridge across a river or to pave a road literally left the country.
Wow.
And so the country immediately fell apart. Poverty, crops rotting in the fields, there was no organization. There was no central government controlling anything. It fell back into anarchy. There was a historian who made the comment, I hate to use the phrase dark ages, but things got really bad after the Romans left. The literacy rate may have dropped to 1% in the country. So,
Any
yeah.
idea what it dropped from?
It had been at least 10% of the Romans, which to our eyes sounds really bad, but for, the Dark Ages,
Right.
for the Middle Ages, I should say, that's pretty good. So they had no organization, complete chaos. Everybody who could wield a sword and gather a bunch of people together took over a part of the country. And you had this patchwork of kings all fighting each other constantly all the time. People were in the fields. People were fighting, so they couldn't go out and plant crops, so everybody starved. Winter came and there was no way to store food over the summer because no one had paid attention when harvest time came, because they were all killing or getting killed. And Arthur's stories, if you read all the King Arthur stories, he is the civilizing hero. He's the one that takes barbarians and forges them into a civilized society.
Okay.
In the modern stories, he's always attached to Christianity, with Christianity seeing themselves as the light of dawn that wipes away the dark barbarism and brings light and peace to the world. But he actually well predates the arrival of Christianity in New England.
Okay.
He was originally just someone who organized different tribes, got them to work together, and for at least part of the country was able to organize things and bring at least a little bit of peace and make things better for people for at least a little while.
So he was a motivational speaker.
Yes, he must have been very good at that. He was good at what he did, assuming that he lived, that he was an actual person. What he was really called, there's references to people named Arturos and things like that, that go back a long way. In some of the writings from that period, there's a writer who mentions some phrases like in the days of good King Arthur, and he mentions it without explaining who Arthur is. So he must have assumed everybody in his audience had already heard of Arthur, so he didn't have to explain it.
Right.
So that meant the Arthur story was already floating around a great deal by that period. And the word Arthur has been a code word for justice and peace and kingship and things like that. Henry VII, the start of the Tudor period, named his firstborn son Arthur, just as a way of helping rally the people behind him.
And you mentioned Welsh.
Mm-hmm. The Welsh have an entire hero cycle and an entire group of gods that I'm not going to get into right now. I can research them and talk about them later if you want.
No. You mentioned that King Arthur originated from Welsh.
A lot of the names of the characters in King Arthur, their original names were Welsh.
Okay.
You can tell because they're mostly consonants and not a lot of vowels. The joke I always tell is the Welsh were very poor people, they couldn't afford any vowels, so everything had to do with consonants. Like Merlin's, one of his older names was Myrmidon, which is almost no vowels in it at all. Arthur was Arturus, which actually sounds a lot like a Latin name that may have been left behind by the Romans.
Right.
They don't think he was a legacy Roman who stayed behind. It's a possibility. It's not impossible.
Okay.
But they find evidence that there was a kind of civilization at a time when they had assumed there wasn't any, and that someone had to organize them, and maybe he was Arthur.
Did you say that they found bones?
They found archaeological digs. They found evidence of cities and things like that at a time when they didn't know there was anyone like successfully living there.
Okay.
They haven't found a tomb or anything they thought was King Arthur's, and no evidence of anything like that.
Okay.
There are several writers who spent, or several archaeologists who spent their whole careers trying to go through and parse through what might have been real about the Arthur myth. And there's several different books on it, including In Search of King Arthur. So a guy named John Matthews has written several books on the topic. But it's all hearsay. There's no real evidence.
Nonetheless, I have to imagine that's a life well lived, just
Yeah.
full of adventure.
Oh yeah, yeah. And we know a lot of the Arthur myth was added by later writers. In the Middle Ages, they added things to it. The doomed love affair with Guinevere was added later in the story when, in the Middle Ages, when courtly romance was very big.
Okay.
You know, knights who were in love with their queen but could never have them and that kind of thing. That's very much personified in the whole Lancelot storyline. Although in most versions he does wind up having her, but that's... Morgan Le Fay and Mordred were added much later to the storyline.
Okay.
And Morgan Le Fay, like I've said, brings in the fairy influence. She's from the French retellings of the story. So like most old stories, they were told and retold over the years and have grown in the telling. So it's considered, that book in particular considers to be part of Celtic mythology.
Okay.
That book was written at least 20 years ago, so it's possible a new book on the topic would not treat him that way. He's certainly worthy of his own book rather than being stuffed into the middle of, you know, the Mabinion and all the Welsh gods and things like that, Rhiannon and so forth. I don't know if there's enough about Arthur more than that to do a whole segment on Arthur. He might have been real. You can't say that he wasn't, but at the same time, there's no concrete evidence that anything he did in legend actually happened.
Mystery.
Yeah, which is fine. That's what this whole thing is based on. And I am a storyteller, so mystery doesn't bother me. All right, so the four great things I am, the four treasures of the Irish people. The Stone of Fowl, the Sword of Nuada. We'll be meeting Nuada soon. He was a king of the Irish people. There's the Spear of Lugh, which is a savage, bloodthirsty spear. The spear was so bloodthirsty, it like vibrated in your hands because it wanted to sink into someone and drink their blood. In fact, it was so violent, the only way to calm it down so you could walk around with it was to stick the head of the spear in a bucket of poppies, and the poppies would dull its senses and put it to sleep. So, it's a pretty powerful spear. There's also the Cauldron of the Dagda, which was the magic cauldron in which no man who went there left unfulfilled. There was an infinite amount of stuff in it. The Irish people were very big into cauldrons. They loved them. And there's a couple of Irish cauldrons, some of which may be the same cauldron told about in different stories. There's also the Welsh have a cauldron, in which if you put like dead bodies into it, they come back to life again. And that was used as the inspiration for a series of stories by Lord Alexander, the first book of which was filmed as The Black Cauldron by the Disney Studios, one of their animated features. One of their least successful animated features, I have to say, even though it's a pretty cool movie. Some of the golden artwork in here, in this book on Heroes of the Dawn, is decorations on the side of cauldrons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. In fact, there's a picture of Dagda on the front of that book. They're pretty sure that's Dagda. Big guy, beard, and his face is stuck in the side of a cauldron. So yeah, we're going to call him Dagda.
Okay.
So the Firbolg were defeated by the Tuatha De Danann. The Tuatha De Danann, the children of the goddess Danu. Some people translate that as the river Danu, but no one knows where there's a river Danu, and there's no record of a goddess named Danu being worshipped. So.
I'm just thinking of the Danube.
Nah, I don't think they came from there. It's possible, but there's no evidence of it. So who were the Tuatha De Danann? The first one was the Dagda that I already mentioned. Dagda literally translates as good God. Not that he was good in the sense of like good versus evil. He was just really good at being a god. He could do everything well.
Okay.
He had mastered every skill. He liked to drink, he liked to party, he liked to eat a lot of food, he loved the ladies. He was always the first one to start a bar brawl and the last one to leave after clearing the floor. He was that kind of a guy. He's sometimes referred to in the same tone as like Odin of the Norse gods,
Okay.
the All-Father and so forth. Weirdly, he's not the king. He should be the king. He shows every signs of being their leader, but he plays a secondary role in almost every story. He's just there, and he's the Dagda.
Second to who?
Other characters like Nuada and Lug and so forth that take center stage in almost all the scenes. He does his part though. He's a big guy with a beard, pot belly. Someone once said he looks like a cross between Santa Claus and Conan the Barbarian.
Well,
So there you go.
he's a drinker.
Yeah. There's also Bridget. Bridget or Breed or Brigay or whatever, a B name. She was very famous. She was one of the big Irish goddesses.
Okay.
She's depicted a lot to this day in posters and t-shirts, and she's all over the internet. She always has red hair. If you see a gorgeous Celtic woman, possibly not wearing very much, with flaming red hair, sometimes literally flaming, that's Bridget.
Okay.
She's one of the ones who is still actively worshipped today. Not only do pagans and Wiccans pay homage to her, but also the Catholics, because her sacred well in Ireland had a Catholic church built over it, and is the Church of Saint Bridget, which the Catholics will say is a mere coincidence, that there was a real woman named Bridget who lived in Kildare and then became a saint, and this is sacramental to her. But it does happen to, the church happens to have been built, the cathedral happens to have been built across what was originally the sacred well of Bridget, the Celtic goddess. And if you're someone who practices Voodoo, she's known as Maman Brahid. She's the consort of Baron Samedi and a goddess of death.
Okay, what is voodoo?
It's what someone told me once I should call voodoo, but actual
Okay.
practitioners call it voodoo. And it could be wrong because I've only known 1 or 2 people who practiced it, and so my experience with it is very limited.
Okay.
It's basically voodoo.
Okay.
The gods of voodoo are known as Loa, or spirits, and most of them are based on Catholic gods.
Wait, does voodoo not originate out of Africa?
It does. However, it technically originates in the Caribbean. Africans who were enslaved came to the New World with their religion as much as they could remember of it as they could.
Right.
They were not allowed to practice their religion. They were all forced to become Christian, usually Catholic.
Okay.
However, they created amongst themselves a synchronized religion in which Catholic saints would become the Loa, the spirits of Africa, that they still actually worshipped.
Right.
And so voodoo became a synchronized religion in which they will use the names of Catholic saints to refer to very ancient African spirits.
Wow.
That is still actively practiced today.
Wow. Interesting.
So Bridget or Brahid is definitely out there.
Is this who you're referring to then?
Yeah, that's her. Yeah, there she is. She was the goddess of healing, the goddess of fire. She was also a smithing goddess, and she was a goddess of poetry, and she was a goddess of wisdom.
Smithing, like blacksmithing?
Yes. And because in the Irish mind that all fits together. She was a goddess of fire. You had a fire in your hearth that warmed your home and cooked your food, but fire was also what tempered metal and made them into weapons and useful tools and things like that. So she was the god of blacksmithing.
Mm-hmm.
And she was also the god of poetry, because people who were artists and poets are said to have a fire in their brain. And so she was the flame of inspiration that burns inside all great artists and poets to this day.
Is she one of your favorites then?
Yeah, she's really cool. Not as cool as the next one we're going to get to, but yeah, and a goddess of healing, because warmth and heat heals you. So she was, and yeah, the Irish weren't very into like having like small purviews for their gods. They cover a broad range of things. So there's Bridget. And the next goddess we've already mentioned, who is the Morrigan.
Before we carry on.
Yes,
Bog burials?
yes, they did that.
Okay, so they're depositing humans in the bogs.
Yes.
Are they dead prior to deposit?
Usually.
So it wasn't like a human sacrifice kind of.
Actually, archaeologists debate that. They found a lot of bog burials, and there's a raging debate as to exactly what they represent. They may have been thrown in there alive as a sacrifice to ancient gods. That may have just been the way they disposed of their bodies.
Right.
The bog preserved their bodies tremendously well. It mummified them naturally. And they may have done it for the very same reason the Egyptians mummified their dead, to preserve the prior generations.
And there's not enough evidence to go one way or the other?
We really don't know. Most of them don't have obvious wounds on them. So it's not like they've been stabbed or had their heart cut out like the Aztecs did. So it's not that obvious a sacrifice.
Right.
There is a leather thong around the necks of many of them. But as someone pointed out, it was originally thought to be strangulation, but it's also been pointed out if they were wearing a necklace, that's how it would look after a few hundred years in the bog. The soft tissue is all gone. So there's no way to actually tell how they died. They're also curled into a fetal position. They were tied in a fetal position before going into the bog. And so there's a possibility that they believed in reincarnation, and they're literally being prepared to be reborn.
Wow.
And again, we can't prove that because it's all an oral tradition that's been long lost.
Or in tying the body, it may have just made it easier to move.
It may have simply been easier to move or to fit in the space they had in the bog.
Right.
But we found a surprising number of them,
Wow.
all across Northern Europe and Ireland and so forth.
Well, okay, that said, are there other significant actual burial sites?
Yes, there are also actual burial sites too.
Enough so that it would kind of warrant the idea that they weren't using the bogs as a disposal system?
They may have put poor people in the bogs and rich people got actual tombs.
Okay.
But again, we can't prove that.
Okay.
The last goddess is the Morrigan. They had a lot of other goddesses, but the Morrigan is the last of the big ones. You mentioned her in Cuchulain's story. She was a goddess of death, also kind of a goddess of love. She was a goddess of war. She was a death goddess. She was like the ultimate goth girl. Brehid always has red hair, and Morrigan always has black hair. She usually has a crow or a raven on her shoulder, or she's always wearing black. Frequently has feathers all over her. Many people pay homage to the Morrigan. I've seen people cosplay as the Morrigan. Someone showed up at King Richard's Fair one time with this cloak of what appeared to be raven feathers.
Right.
It was fake feathers, of course, but she had this long feathered cloak that trailed all the way down to the ground. She was awesome.
It was very cool.
Yeah. So the Morrigan is very big. She was highly respected, being goddess of death. Supposedly in those days, after a war, when a large number of people died, you would leave them on the battlefield for 24 hours. So the crows would have plenty of time to pick at the bodies. Because crows are carrion birds, and she's the crow goddess.
Oh.
That was your homage to Morrigan.
Right.
To a certain extent, they thought she represented fate as well. Much like the Valkyries, who were the choosers of the slain, who would pluck people off the battlefield at the moment of their death. Morrigan had the same ability.
Okay.
So you didn't necessarily want to draw her attention, but you always wanted to be on her good side. So yes, she was very big. And I think perhaps you might want to stop there.
But I'm so intrigued.
I know. The next part is really cool. Because once they established themselves in Ireland and lived there for who knows how many years, that was like their golden age, probably hundreds of years.
Okay.
But eventually the island was invaded. Ireland was invaded again, this time by the Fomorans. The Fomorans are a race of monstrous creatures. Many of them were hideous and misshapen. They were huge creatures. Some of them are part animal, part human. But oddly, the women are all strangely beautiful. And there's a couple of romances between the Fomorans and the Tuatha De Danann, always involving hot Fomoran women.
Okay.
Which is something we'll encounter again. One of the things that the Tuatha De Danann have in common with the Norse gods is their major enemies are both giants. And the giants are all really ugly guys, but attractive women.
Huh.
Who, despite being giants, are short enough that Norse guys have no trouble hooking up with them.
Good to know.
What are you going to do? Yeah. So, yeah.
Where there's a will, there's a way.
So the Tuatha De Danann against the Fomorans, next time we meet for conversations. I have been Ed.
Solitaire.
And we'll see you next time. Until then, be careful.